My name is Kayla Morrison. I'm 26 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning I placed a small recording device in my bedroom and went to school and came home 3 hours later to find out that everything I had suspected for 2 years was exactly as bad as I thought. But I need to start where the story actually begins. My parents divorced when I was 11. Not dramatically, not the kind of divorce that has a single identifiable cause. The kind that happens when two people have been moving in different directions for years and finally acknowledge that the directions are not going to converge. My mother moved to an apartment 15 minutes away. My father stayed in the house. I split my time between them in the standard every other week arrangement that the family court system produces. My father met Sandra when I was 13. I want to be precise about Sandra, because this story requires precision and because Sandra was not, in most respects, a bad person. She was a dental hygienist, 41 when I met her, with 2 adult children from a previous relationship who had moved out and who she saw on holidays. She was pleasant in the specific way of someone who is trying to make a good impression on a child who did not ask for her to exist. She brought food when she came over. She laughed at my father's jokes in a way that made it clear she actually found them funny, which was, I will admit, better than the alternative. For the first year things were fine, not close. I did not want a stepmother, and Sandra seemed to understand this without requiring it to be explained. We occupied the same space with mutual courtesy and kept appropriate distance, which was what I needed and what she seemed willing to provide. The searching started in year 2. I did not know what was happening at first. What I knew was that things were different when I came home than when I had left them. Small things, the specific way I fold my clothes, the order of items in my desk drawer, the position of things on my bookshelf. Not dramatically different, subtly different, the kind of different that you notice if you are a person who pays attention to the arrangement of your own space, and I was that person. I mentioned it to my father once early on. He said, Sandra probably tidied up. She likes things neat, I said. I like my things the way I left them. He said, Kayla, she's trying to help. I said, I didn't ask for help. He said, be fair to her. She's not used to having a teenager in the house. I said, I'm in the house 2 weeks out of 4. She has the other 2 to arrange things however she wants. He said, let's not make this a bigger deal than it is. I let it go. The searching continued. I want to describe what I mean by searching because I want to be precise. I do not mean that Sandra reorganized my room or that she cleaned in ways I found intrusive. I mean that she went through my belongings in the specific systematic way of someone who is looking for something. My clothes, including my laundry, which sat in a hamper in the corner of my room between wash days, my desk, my bookshelf, the box under my bed where I kept letters and journals, and the ordinary private accumulation of a teenage girl's inner life. I know she went through the laundry specifically because of something that happened when I was 15. I had been at a party, a house party, the kind that exists at every high school in every suburb in America, with a keg someone's older brother had obtained and the specific social pressure of being 15 and wanting to belong. I had 2 beers. I came home slightly flushed but not drunk, went to bed, and woke up the next morning to my father sitting at the kitchen table with an expression I had not seen before. He said, Sandra found something in your laundry. I said, what? He said, your shirt, it smelled like beer. I said, I was at a party. He said, you told me you were at Emma's house studying. I said, we studied first. He said, Kayla. I said, it was 2 beers. I'm fine. He said, that's not the point. You lied to me. He was not wrong that I had lied. But I was 15 and he was the parent, and the question of whether his wife was going through my dirty laundry to check for evidence of my behavior was a question I did not yet have the language or the standing to raise effectively. What I understood sitting at that kitchen table at 15 was that Sandra had gone through my dirty laundry, had smelled my shirt, had reported what she found to my father. I did not say this. I took the consequence. I was grounded for 2 weeks, and I went back to my mother's and I thought about what had happened. My mother's response when I told her was the response of a woman who was trying to stay out of her ex-husband's household management while also not being able to entirely suppress her reaction. She said, she smelled your shirt. I said, yes. She said, from the laundry hamper. I said, yes. My mother said nothing for a moment. She said, Kayla, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it carefully. I said, okay. She said, I'm not going to tell you your father is wrong to have rules about parties and alcohol. He's your parent and those are his rules to make. But I am going to tell you that going through someone's dirty laundry to check for evidence of their behavior is not normal parenting. It's surveillance. I said, yes. She said, and I want you to start paying attention to what else she might be doing. I said, I already am. I want to describe the following 2 years because the full picture requires them. I was a good student. Not perfect. I had a B in chemistry in 10th grade that I was not proud of but consistently good, the kind of student whose teachers used words like diligent and thoughtful in the comments sections of report cards. I was not a troubled teenager. I had friends, I had interests, I had the ordinary complications of adolescence managed within the ordinary range of how adolescence is supposed to be managed. I was also, from the age of 15, conducting a systematic observation of what Sandra was doing in my room. I developed a method. Before I left for my father's every other week, I placed specific items in specific positions and noted them. A hair across the crease of my journal, a book placed at The laundry hamper with the handle facing a specific direction. Small things that Sandra would not notice she had disturbed but that I would notice had been disturbed when I returned. Almost every week something had been disturbed. She was consistent. She was thorough. And she was reporting what she found to my father, because I began to notice a correlation between the weeks when I could tell she had been through my things and the conversations my father initiated with me about specific topics, conversations that required him to have information he would not have had unless someone had told him. The journal was the most significant. I kept a journal from the time I was 12. Not the kind with a lock, the kind that sits on a shelf and relies on the implicit understanding that a person's private thoughts are their own. I had written in it about ordinary things, friendships, anxieties, the boy I had a crush on in 9th grade, the specific texture of being a teenager in a divided household. I had also written, in the way that journals become the place where you say what you cannot say elsewhere, about Sandra. Not cruelly, I was not a cruel child. I had written about the shirt incident, about the feeling of being watched in my own room, about the specific quality of discomfort that came from knowing someone was going through my things and not being able to say so directly. When I was 16, my father said to me during what had started as a conversation about my college plans, "I know you've been having a hard time adjusting to the new arrangement." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I know you're not comfortable. I know you feel like she's intruding." I said, "Who told you that?" He said, "I just want you to know that she's trying." I said, "Dad, who told you that?" He said, "Nobody told me anything. I can see it." He could not see it. We were in the same house 2 weeks out of 4 and our interactions were pleasant and normal. There was nothing to see. The only place those specific words existed was in my journal. I said, "Did Sandra read my journal?" He said, "Kayla, He said, "She's trying to understand you." I said nothing. I went back to my room. I sat on my bed. I thought about what had just happened. Then I called my mother. My mother's response this time was different from the first time, more considered. Less immediate. She said, "Kayla, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be honest." I said, "Okay." She said, "You feel safe?" I said, "Physically, yes. I'm not in danger." She said, "But your privacy is being violated consistently." I said, "Yes." She said, "And your father is defending it." I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay. I want to talk to a lawyer before we do anything else." I said, "A lawyer?" She said, "You're a minor living part-time in a household where an adult is going through your private belongings and reading your journal and reporting the contents to your father. I want to understand what our options are." The lawyer my mother consulted told her that the situation, while deeply inappropriate, did not rise to the level of legal intervention in the way she had hoped. I was not being abused. I was not in danger, and the parenting decisions being made in my father's household, however questionable, were within his legal authority as a custodial parent. The lawyer said that documentation would be important if the situation escalated, or if my mother wanted to revisit. Documentation. I was 16 years old and I had been told to document. I documented. I want to describe what documentation looked like for me over the following year because it is the part of this story that I am most deliberate about. I bought a small notebook, not a journal, a notebook, and I began keeping a log, dates and observations, the specific items I had placed and the specific ways they had been disturbed. The conversations my father had initiated that correlated with the searches. The specific things he said that could only have come from Sandra having access to information she should not have had. I was 16 and I was keeping evidence logs. This is what it looks like when a teenager is not believed about something real that is happening to them. The recording came in year 3. I was 17. It was a Saturday morning. I was at my father's house and I was leaving for the day. I had plans with friends. I would be gone from 10 in the morning until at least 4 in the afternoon. I had by this point been documenting for a year. I had a notebook with 18 months of observations. I knew the pattern. I knew that Sandra used the time when I was out of the house to go through my room. I knew she was systematic and thorough and that she had been doing this for 3 years. What I did not have was direct evidence. What I had was circumstantial, the disturbed items, the correlated conversations, enough to know what was happening, not enough to prove it to my father in a way that he could not dismiss. I had learned about recording laws in a civics class. North Carolina, where we lived, is a one-party consent state, meaning that a recording is legal as long as one party to the conversation or one person present in the space consents. I was not sure this applied to recording in my own room, so I did something that I think was the right decision. I called my mother before I did anything. She called her lawyer. The lawyer said, "In North Carolina, recording in a space you have legal access to and occupy is generally permissible. A recording device in her bedroom at her father's house, where she is a legal resident and has the right to be, would likely be admissible." Likely. I decided that likely was enough. I placed the device, a small audio recorder I had purchased with my own money, in my room. I positioned it carefully. I left for the day. I came home at 3:30. I sat in my room and I listened to the recording. Sandra had entered my room at 11:14 in the morning. I know this because the recording captures the sound of the door opening and her footsteps on the hardwood floor. She was in my room for 41 minutes. I am not going to describe everything that is on that recording, because some of it is private in ways that belong to me and not to this story. What I will describe is the structure of it, what she did and in what order, because the order tells you something about how systematic this was. She started with the laundry hamper. She went through it item by item. I could hear the specific sounds of fabric being moved, examined, replaced. She moved to the desk. Desk drawers open and close in sequence, not haphazardly in order left to right, top to bottom. The sound of papers being moved. The sound of items being replaced. She moved to the bookshelf, books being pulled out and replaced. The specific sound of pages being turned. She was looking through them, not reading them. The rapid flip of someone checking for items hidden between pages. She moved to the box under the bed. I heard the box being pulled out. I heard the specific sounds of letters being unfolded and refolded. I heard the specific sound of my journal being opened. She was in the room for 41 minutes, then she left. Then at 12:47 she called my father. I know this because she made the call from the hallway just outside my door and the recording captured it. I'm not going to reproduce the full content of that call because some of it is personal information about me that I do not choose to share. But I will say this, she reported to him in detail. She had notes, she read from notes. She had been taking notes while she was in my room. My father listened. He asked questions. He said, okay, we'll talk to her this weekend. I sat in my room after I listened to the recording. I called my mother. I said, I have it. She said, what did you get? I said, 41 minutes of her going through everything. The laundry, the desk, the bookshelf, the box under the bed. In a phone call to Dad where she read him notes. My mother was quiet for a moment. She said, notes. I said, she took notes while she was in my room. She read them to him on the phone. My mother said, Kayla. I said, yes. She said, I'm coming to get you. She came to get me. We sat at her kitchen table that evening and listened to the recording together. All 41 minutes of it. And the phone call. My mother was very controlled while she was listening. She has the specific quality of someone who processes difficult things internally and does not externalize until she has completed the processing. She listened to all of it and she said nothing until it was finished. Then she said, we're calling the lawyer. The lawyer's response to the recording was the response of someone who has been presented with better evidence than they expected. She said, this is significant. She said, this establishes a documented pattern of surveillance in a minor's private space. The phone call in particular, the notes, the reporting, this is not incidental or occasional. This is systematic, she said. I think we have grounds to revisit the custody arrangement. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom confrontation. I want to be honest about that because this story could be told as though everything resolved in a single climactic moment, and it did not. What followed was a process, legal and personal and slow, that took several months and required my mother and her attorney to present the evidence in a formal proceeding and require my father to respond to it. His response in the formal proceeding was that Sandra had been concerned about my welfare and had been checking on me out of care. The attorney presented the recording, the 41 minutes, the notes, the phone call. My father's attorney asked for a recess. My father called me that evening. He said, Kayla. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know it was like that. I said, I told you when I was 15. I told you she was going through my things. He said, I thought you were adjusting. I thought it was normal friction. I said, going through someone's dirty laundry and reading their journal and taking notes and reporting to you on the phone is not normal friction. He said, no. He said, it's not. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. He said, I should have listened. I said, yes. He said, when you were 15, when you told me. I said, yes. He said, I chose to believe that you were having a hard time adjusting instead of listening to what you were actually telling me. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry for that. Specifically, I said, I know. He said, what do you need from me? I said, I need this to stop. I need to be able to be in your house without being surveilled. And I need you to be the parent who believes me when I tell you something is wrong. He said, yes. He said, I can do that. He said, I want to do that. The formal custody modification was minor in its legal terms but significant in its practical effect. Sandra was not required to leave. They were in a relationship and she lived there, and that was not something the court was going to change. But specific provisions were added to the custody arrangement regarding my privacy in my own space, and my father signed an agreement acknowledging those provisions. And the process of signing that agreement was the process of him acknowledging formally and legally that what had happened was not acceptable. Sandra and I did not have a direct conversation about the recording or its contents. I did not seek one. She knew that I knew that she knew that I knew. The dynamic between us shifted in the specific way that dynamics shift when one person has been caught doing something they cannot defend, and both people understand this without it needing to be said. She was in my father's house for another year before they broke up. I do not know the specifics of why they broke up because I was not present for whatever happened between them, and my father has not shared it. I know only that they did, and that in the year between the custody modification and the breakup, Sandra did not go through my things. I know this because I continue to document, not from anger, from habit, and from the understanding that documentation is what had made it possible to be believed. My father and I have a relationship now that is different from what it was when I was 15 and 16 and 17. Not entirely repaired, some things that happen between parents and children leave marks that don't fully resolve, but different, more honest. The specific honesty of two people who have been through something difficult and have arrived somewhere more real on the other side of it. He comes to things now, not military ceremonies, he's not that kind of father, but the ordinary things, my college graduation, my apartment warming. The birthday dinners that my mother and father have both attended since I turned 21. Sitting on opposite sides of the table and managing their shared history with the specific courtesy of people who have decided that their daughter matters more than whatever remains of the friction between them. he said, at my graduation. I'm proud of you, I said. Thank you, he said, for everything. Not just today, I said. I know, he said. I should have listened at 15, I said. Yes. But you listened eventually. He said, the recording, I said. Yes. He said, I needed to hear it to believe it. I said, I know. He said, you shouldn't have had to do that. I said, no, but I did, and it worked. He said, it worked. I said, yes. He said, you were 17 years old and you figured out how to document something that an adult was telling you wasn't happening. I said, I had help. He said, your mother, I said, and the lawyer. In the civics class that taught me about one-party consent, he laughed. The genuine one, he said. The civics class, I said. It was useful, he said. Yes, he said. Kayla, I said. Yes, he said. I'm sorry I made you need a civics class to protect yourself in my house. I said, I know, Dad. He said, I mean it. I said, I know you do. I am 26 years old. I have a recording that is 41 minutes long and a notebook with 18 months of observations, and a custody modification that acknowledges what happened formally and legally. I also have a father who said I should have listened at 15 and meant it. Sandra went through my laundry and my desk and my bookshelf and the box under my bed and my journal and took notes and read them to my father on the phone. Until I placed a recorder in my room and came home 3 hours later with 41 minutes of evidence. And then the conversation changed. That is the whole of it. That is enough. That has always been enough. Some things require documentation. Some 17-year-olds know how to provide it. And some fathers eventually listen. Better late, considerably better than the alternative. There is something I want to add that happened after graduation, something that completed the picture in a way I did not expect. My father called me about 3 months after graduation. Not about anything specific. He calls regularly now, which is itself something that would have surprised me at 15. He called on a Tuesday evening and we talked for a while about ordinary things, and then he said, I've been thinking about something. I said, what? He said, the notebook. I said, which notebook? He said, the one you kept, the log, the dates and the observations. I said, yes. He said, how long did you keep it? I said, from when I was 16 until the recording. About 18 months, he said. 18 months of writing down what you noticed. I said, yes. He said, every week. I said, approximately. When I was at your house. He said, while you were also going to school and doing everything else a 16-year-old does. I said, yes. He said, Kayla. I said, yes. He said, I've been thinking about what that must have been like. To be 16 and keeping an evidence log in secret because you knew something was wrong and you knew the adult who was supposed to believe you wasn't going to. I said, it was what the situation required. He said, yes. But I was the adult who was supposed to believe you. I said, yes. He said, and I made you keep a notebook instead. I said, yes. He said, for 18 months. I said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I want to ask you something and I want you to be honest. I said, okay. He said, what did you think of me during that period? When you were 16 and keeping the notebook and I kept telling you were overreacting, I thought about how to answer this honestly. I said, I thought you had chosen to believe what was convenient rather than what was true. He said, yes. I said, I understood why. Sandra was there every day and I was there every other week, and it was easier to believe that I was having trouble adjusting than to believe that the person you were in a relationship with was doing something wrong. He said, easier and wrong. I said, yes. He said, I chose the easier thing. I said, yes. He said, and you kept a notebook for 18 months because I chose the easier thing. I said, yes. He said, and then you got a recording. I said, yes. He said, and I heard it. I said, yes. He said, and I could not choose the easier thing anymore. I said, no. He said, Kayla. I said, yes. He said, I want to tell you something about that phone call. When I called you the evening after the attorney played the recording. I said, yes. He said, I had spent that afternoon listening to 41 minutes of Sandra going through your room, and the phone call where she read me notes. He said, and I kept thinking about the conversations I had with you. When you were 15 and you told me she was going through your things. When you were 16 and you asked me directly if she had read your journal. He said, I kept thinking about the specific things I said to you. Let's not make this a bigger deal than it is. She's trying to understand you. I can see you're having trouble adjusting. He said, I said those things to you while she was taking notes. I said, yes. He said, while she was reading your journal and reporting to me on the phone. I said, yes. He said, and I was telling you that you were the one who was having trouble adjusting. I said, yes. He said, that must have been, I don't know what that must have been like. I said, it was lonely. Being certain about something that the person who was supposed to believe you kept telling you wasn't happening. He said, yes. He said, Kayla, I want to say something that I haven't said directly. I said, okay. He said, I don't just owe you an apology for not believing you. I owe you an apology for what it cost you to prove it. He said, the notebook. 18 months of careful observation and documentation because I wasn't listening. The research about recording laws, the recorder you bought with your own money. The day you sat in your room and listened to 41 minutes of evidence. He said, you were 17 years old and you had to do all of that because I was the parent who wasn't doing his job. I said, you were the parent who eventually did. He said, when the recording made it impossible not to. I said, yes. But you did. He said, that's a low bar. I said, it is. But it's the bar that was available and you cleared it. He said, I cleared it at 17 when I should have cleared it at 15. I said, yes. He said, 2 years of notebooks. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry for the notebooks, Kayla, specifically, for making them necessary. I said, I know. He said, do you forgive me? I thought about this honestly because he asked for honesty and he deserved it. I said, I forgave you a while ago, not all at once. Gradually. As the evidence accumulated that you were actually trying to be different, he said, the graduation, the apartment warming, the Tuesday calls, I said yes. He said, those are the evidence, I said yes. He said, that's very you, the evidence accumulating, I said, I learned it from the notebooks. He laughed, I laughed. He said, you learned to document from having to document. I said, yes. He said, and now you document your father's rehabilitation. I said, I wouldn't call it rehabilitation. He said, what would you call it? I said, I'd call it catching up. Being the father you should have been at 15, starting from when you were ready to be. He said, 38. I was 38 when you were 15. I said, yes. He said, old enough to know better. I said, yes. But people know better at different rates. He said, that's generous. I said, it's accurate. He said, Kayla. I said, yes. He said, the Tuesday calls. I said, yes. He said, I'm going to keep making them. I said, I know. He said, because I have some catching up to do. I said, yes. He said, and because you're my daughter. I said, yes. He said, and because I owe you 18 months of notebooks. I said, you don't owe me anything specific. He said, I want to. I said, then keep calling on Tuesdays. He said, I will. He has every Tuesday. I am 26 years old. I have a father who calls on Tuesdays. I have a recording that is 41 minutes long. I have a notebook with 18 months of observations that I have never thrown away, and that sits in the box under my bed in my own apartment. My own apartment, where no one goes through my things, where the laundry hamper sits in the corner undisturbed, where the journal on the shelf is exactly where I left it when I come home. Sandra went through my laundry and my desk and my bookshelf and my journal and took notes and read them on the phone. Until I placed a recorder in my room and documented 41 minutes of evidence. And then my father listened, and then he called on Tuesdays. Some things require documentation, some fathers require evidence. Some 26-year-olds still have the notebook. I have mine. It is in the box under my bed. It is the record of 18 months of being certain about something that no one who should have believed me was willing to believe. It is also the record of a 17-year-old who decided that if no one was going to listen to her words, she would find a way to make them listen to something else. She did. I did. That is the whole of it. That is enough. That has always been enough. One last thing. Last month I was visiting my mother and I mentioned the notebook, the 18 months of observations, and she asked if she could see it. I had never shown it to anyone. Not my mother during the process, not the lawyer, not anyone. The lawyer had seen the recording. The custody modification referenced the pattern without requiring the notebook specifically. The notebook had been mine, my private record of my own experience, kept in the same spirit that journals are kept, as a place where what is real can be named even when naming it elsewhere is not possible. I showed it to my mother. She sat at her kitchen table and read it. She read all of it. 45 pages, 18 months, the dates and the observations and the correlations, the week the hamper handle was moved, and 2 days later my father brought up the party at a house I hadn't told him about. The week the journal was disturbed, and 3 days later my father asked me about something I had written. Entry after entry, the specific careful language of a 16-year-old trying to be precise about something she needed to be believed about. My mother read all of it without saying anything. When she finished, she looked up. She said, you wrote this when you were 16. I said, yes. She said, this is a legal document. I said, it's a notebook. She said, this is the kind of documentation that attorneys ask for and rarely get because clients don't think to do it until it's too late. She said, you did this at 16 without anyone telling you to. I said, the lawyer said to document. I documented. She said she told you to document. She didn't tell you to do it like this. I said, I didn't know another way. She said, Kayla. I said, yes. She said, I want you to know something. I said, what? She said, when this was happening, when you were 16 and keeping this and I was trying to figure out what we could do, I was scared. I said, of what? She said, that I wouldn't be able to help you. That the situation would continue and I wouldn't be able to stop it and you would spend 2 years in a household where an adult was treating you this way and I couldn't protect you from it. I said, you got me a lawyer. She said, yes. And the lawyer said document, and you documented. And I couldn't tell whether it was going to be enough. I said it was enough. She said the recording was enough. I said yes. She said, but this, she held up the notebook, this was the foundation. I said yes. She said, 18 months of you being precise and careful and consistent because you knew that's what the situation required. I said yes. She said, at 16. I said yes. She said, I'm very proud of you. I know I say that, but specifically for this, for having the discipline to do this when you were 16 and scared and nobody was believing you. I said I wasn't scared. She said, yes, you were. I said yes, I was. She said, and you kept the notebook anyway. I said yes. She said, that's the thing I'm most proud of. I said the notebook. She said the continuing, the not stopping, the keeping of the record even when it felt like no one was going to care about what the record said. I said someone cared. She said yes. Eventually I said you always cared. She said yes, but I needed the recording too to make your father care. I said yes. She said you built that case. At 16, I said we built it together. She said you started it. I said yes. She said, Kayla. I said yes. She said, I love you. I said, I love you too, Mom. She said, good. She handed the notebook back. I put it in my bag. It is still in the box under my bed in my apartment, the apartment where no one goes through my things, where the laundry hamper sits undisturbed, where the journal is where I left it. I am 26 years old. I have the notebook. I have the recording. I have a father who calls on Tuesdays. I have a mother who read 45 pages and said I'm most proud of the continuing. That is the whole of it. That is everything. That is enough.